The last thing Dr. Mara Solis heard before the machine fired was a sound she couldn't place, a faint, dry whisper from somewhere inside the chamber, like a page turning in an empty room. She didn't investigate. She had been awake for 31 hours, her notes were 3 weeks behind, and the Veth were coming regardless of whether she was ready. The transit device had worked 17 times in controlled trials. She stepped in, hit the activation sequence, and the world came apart. It put itself back together wrong. She knew before the chamber opened. The left side of her body felt wrong in a way that had no name in human language, not pain exactly. More like a fundamental disagreement between what her nervous system expected to find and what was actually there. She pressed her palm flat against the chamber wall to steady herself, and the palm that touched the wall was not entirely hers. Outside, the Veth fleet was already in high orbit. She had 40 minutes, maybe less. She did not look at herself in the reflective surface of the chamber door, not yet. 2 months earlier, the Veth had given humanity what they called a gift. The translation matrices were still imprecise in those early weeks, so the exact phrasing got debated endlessly in the briefing rooms. But the meaning was clear enough. They had chosen Earth as a subject of study. They were coming to observe, record, and assess. The assessment would take approximately 60 days. At the end of 60 days, a determination would be made. They did not say what the determination was a determination of. The Veth were the 5th spacefaring civilization humanity had encountered, and by far the most advanced. Their ships moved without visible propulsion. Their communications arrived faster than light. Their biology, what the xenobiologists could piece together from the initial contact, suggested a collective cognition, something distributed across the swarm rather than housed in any individual. They did not experience the world the way humans did. They experienced it all at once, from everywhere simultaneously, processed through millions of perception nodes operating in parallel. They found humans baffling. They said so directly in the 3rd week of contact. The concept of a consciousness housed in a single body, receiving information through only 2 eyes and 2 ears, constructing a model of reality from that cramped, sequential trickle of data. They called it a kind of poverty. They were not being cruel, they were being accurate by their own standards. They were also, Dr. Solis had noted in her research logs, completely wrong about what that poverty made humans capable of. She had spent the 60 days working on a transit device, a personal teleporter, the first in human history to function at the molecular level. The principle was sound. The engineering was brutal. She had been subsisting on coffee and 4 hours of sleep, and the quiet, stubborn certainty that there was something humans understood about making things work to pressure, that the Veth, with all their distributed perfection, had never had to learn. On day 58, the device worked. On day 59, she climbed inside with whatever else was in the chamber and came out the other side of something she did not yet have words for. She allowed herself 30 seconds to sit on the floor of the laboratory with her back against the machine. Just 30 seconds. Her mother had been a surgeon, and her mother's rule had been, you get your panic, but you schedule it. 30 seconds now. Deal with what's real after. She counted. 12 seconds in, she stopped thinking about herself and started thinking about the Veth. They communicated through swarm coordination, millions of perception nodes firing in synchronized patterns, generating what amounted to a kind of living signal. The human researchers had been trying to decode it for 2 months. They'd gotten maybe 40% of the vocabulary. The Veth, for their part, had decoded human language in approximately 11 days and expressed mild disappointment at the limited bandwidth. What Mara had realized, alone in the lab on Night 51, was that the Veth's primary advantage wasn't intelligence, it was simultaneity. They saw everything at once. They processed in parallel. They were, structurally, impossible to surprise. Her transit device didn't create a weapon, it created a proof. The Veth assessed civilizations, their contact protocols suggested, on the basis of their cognitive architecture. Sequential processors, single mind species, were catalogued and left alone, or absorbed or occasionally ended, depending on factors the Veth considered self-evident and that humans were still trying to understand. What the Veth had never encountered in 400 years of contact history was a single-mind species that had voluntarily fractured its own cognition to interface with the world differently. That was the theory. 30 seconds were up. She stood, flexed her left hand, the one that was no longer entirely hers, and went to find her research notes. The compound eyes were the hardest to adjust to. She understood intellectually what had happened. In the transit, her atoms had merged with whatever small living thing had been in the chamber with her. The merger was not random. The machine's pattern lock had tried to sort and recombine and had done its best, which was imperfect. Her left arm and her vision system had taken on characteristics of the other organism. Her right side remained fully human. The compound vision was, she sat at her desk for a long moment, just breathing, extraordinary. She could see the entire room simultaneously. Not the way a camera sees a room, a flat recording of the light that hit it. She saw it the way a space is actually structured, the desk and the window and the equipment racks and the door, all present at once, each one real and detailed and whole. She could track the mote of dust, drifting past the lamp, while reading the text on the monitor directly in front of her without shifting her focus. She could see the cracks in the ceiling tile above her, and the wear pattern on the floor beneath her chair and the sky outside, and the first bright silhouettes of Veth ships descending through cloud cover, all of it, simultaneously, all of it now. Her left hand was the other problem. It was functional. She could grip things with it, write with it, but the fine motor control was recalibrated for a different musculature, and when she reached for her coffee cup, her fingers made 3 small preparatory adjustments that were not how human hands worked, a kind of rapid testing and correcting, like a computation being run, before closing on the handle. She watched this happen scientifically, and then drank the coffee, and then felt something that took her a moment to identify as wonder. She typed with her right hand. The notes she left for Ernesto, her research partner, were exact and unsentimental. She described what had happened, described her current physical state with clinical precision, and then described what she intended to do. She told him where her personal files were, in case she didn't come back. She told him not to call anyone until the meeting with the Veth delegation was over, one way or the other. She told him that the backup transit logs were encrypted under a key she'd left in the physical folder labeled Ashtray Experiment, because she'd never throw away a file she might need and had learned long ago to label decoys with the most boring possible names. She hit send, picked up her access card, and went to meet the Veth. The meeting chamber was in the Central Research Complex, a round room with high ceilings that the architects had clearly intended to feel impressive, and that felt, under the current circumstances, like a snow globe. The Veth delegation occupied the center of the room in a configuration that Mara had to see all at once to understand. 17 distinct nodes arranged in a pattern that was also a sentence. A standing statement of identity and intent that the partial translation matrices could only approximate as, "We are the assessors, and the assessment proceeds." 2 of the other human researchers were already there. Dr. Cho, the xenolinguist, and General Vasquez, who represented the Security Council and who looked, Mara thought, exactly like someone who had not slept in 2 months waiting to find out whether his species was going to be absorbed or ended. Mara walked in, and the Veth noticed her immediately. She could see them notice her, with her compound eyes, a ripple through the swarm configuration, a synchronization shift, the 17 nodes briefly reorganizing around a new axis of attention. She was something they had not filed, a single-body organism with distributed visual processing, a sequential thinker with parallel perception. Her left hand moved through its quiet little computations as she crossed the room, 3 small preparatory adjustments before she set her bag on the table, and she saw 2 of the node configurations respond to that too, a kind of involuntary lean toward her, an attention they couldn't entirely account for. Good. The swarm spoke. The translation matrix rendered it approximately as, "The assessment is complete. The conclusion has been reached. Do you wish the conclusion to be communicated in human linguistic form?" "Yes," said General Vasquez. The assessment was communicated. The Veth had catalogued humanity as a Class 4 sequential cognitive species with above-average tool use and a notable but unremarkable tendency toward in-group cooperation under external threat. Class 4 species were not candidates for integration. They were not currently candidates for termination. They were candidates for what the Veth called observational continuance, essentially left alone in a kind of benign quarantine. Visited periodically, allowed to develop on their own curve, too limited to be useful, and not dangerous enough to require action. Mara had been listening with both her eyes and her brain, and the part of her that was no longer entirely human, which was doing something she didn't have language for yet, and she raised her hand. The swarm turned toward her in full configuration, all 17 nodes. The temperature in the room seemed to shift. "I'd like to demonstrate something," she said, "before the assessment is finalized." She set the device on the table. It wasn't impressive looking, a flat rectangle of brushed aluminum housing, the pattern lock assembly, smaller than a hardcover book. She plugged the external display into the room's main screen. "This is a molecular transit system," she said, "personal scale. It disintegrates an organic subject at the atomic level and reconstructs it at a target point, preserving pattern integrity at," she checked the display, 99.7% fidelity. "The 0.3% is still a work in progress." She said this last part with a calm she was genuinely surprised to find she had, given that the 0.3% was currently expressing itself in her left arm and both her eyes. She pulled up the transit logs on the main screen. The compound vision let her watch the Veth and the screen simultaneously. She saw the swarm nodes processing, saw the nodes that were probably the Veth equivalent of scientists leaning harder toward the display data, saw General Vasquez and Dr. Chogo very still in their chairs, trying to figure out what she was doing. "The machine works," she said. "I've run 19 successful trials. But yesterday's trial produced a complication. There was a second organism in the transit chamber when I activated the sequence. The machine reconstructed both organisms using the same pattern lock, which merged us at approximately the cellular level." She kept her voice level. "I am currently operating with compound visual processing across both optic lobes, lateral perception coverage of approximately 270 degrees, and modified fine motor function in my left hand." She held the left hand up and let it do its small, rapid computations, 3 adjustments, 4. Reaching for nothing, finding nothing, the alien geometry of a movement system calibrated for a different kind of life. "I am still me," she said. "I am also something new," the swarm reconfigured. She had never seen a Veth configuration she could call surprised, but this one was as close as the translation matrix had ever gotten her. The nodes reorganized along axes she hadn't seen before. The room's temperature shifted again. "You did this intentionally," the swarm said. "You altered your own cognitive architecture." "Not exactly," Mara said. "I made a mistake." "That's different." She could see with her compound eyes Dr. Cho's hands tightened on the edge of the table. She could see General Vasquez's jaw muscles move. "The distinction is important to you," the swarm said. "Yes," she said. Profoundly. "I built a machine that worked. Then I ran it wrong, and the machine incorporated that error into the result, and now I can see the interim simultaneously. I didn't design that outcome. I stumbled into it the way humans stumble into most of our significant advances, through the organized application of intelligence to a situation we didn't entirely control." She paused. "That's not poverty," she said. "That's the engine." The room was quiet. She pressed on. "Your assessment categorized us as Class 4 sequential cognitive processors. I want to submit a correction." She pulled up a second display window. The logs from 19 trials show repeated small optimizations made under time pressure, without access to full system data, using incomplete information and partial models. Each of those optimizations improved the outcome beyond what the original design specified, not because the design was bad, because human cognition, operating under constraint, finds solutions that aren't in the original problem space. She pulled up the comparison she'd run at 3 a.m. the previous night, the night before the machine had misfired. Humans aren't slow sequential processors. We're sequential processors who routinely generate outputs that exceed our inputs. The mechanism for that is error, is constraint, is the thing your species would call poverty and that we call necessity. The swarm was very still. You have never made a mistake, Mara said. Not in 400 years of contact history. You process in parallel. You have total information access across the swarm. You have been right so consistently that the concept of being wrong has no operational meaning in your cognitive architecture. She kept her voice quiet, the way you keep your voice when you're saying something you're not certain of and need the other person to hear the uncertainty. I think that's beautiful. I also think it's a limitation you don't have language for yet, because you've never needed the language. The swarm turned. It was not a physical movement. The nodes didn't shift in space, but the attention of 17 distributed cognitive nodes, reorganizing to face a new conclusion, had a presence she could feel even through the compound eyes. A vast slow rotation of awareness, like the ocean choosing a new direction. The organism that merged with you, the swarm said. A fly, she said. She watched them process that. Small one-node configuration offered. The translation matrix rendered this tentatively, struggling with the grammatical register. Unremarkable. Yes, Mara said. Very small, unremarkable. It had been in the chamber because laboratories have small, unremarkable things in them, and no one thought to check. She turned her compound eyes toward the display and then toward the swarm and let them see her do both simultaneously. It had compound eyes better than anything we could have engineered, a sensory system tuned for 270-degree threat detection, response times faster than conscious thought. Everything I would have needed and couldn't have designed myself in time. She set her left hand flat on the table. 3 small adjustments. 4. I didn't design any of that, she said. I needed it, and the situation provided it, and I survived the combination. The silence in the room had a different quality now. She could feel it. You are arguing, the swarm said, that failure is a mechanism of advancement. I'm arguing that failure, constraint, incompleteness, and error are the specific conditions under which human cognition operates above its rated capacity, she said. I'm arguing that you have never assessed a species under those conditions, because every other species you've encountered has either matched your architecture closely enough to be integrated or differed from it clearly enough to be discarded. You have never assessed a species that evolved in poverty and learned to run hotter than its design spec because that was the only way to stay alive. She heard, very distantly, General Vasquez exhale. The determination, she said. Whatever it was going to be, I'm asking you to run it again. The Veth took 11 minutes. Mara sat at the table and watched the nodes with her compound eyes and tried not to think about her left hand, which was doing its small computations without being asked, reaching and correcting and reaching again, practicing movements she hadn't consciously initiated. She watched it the way you watch a child learn to walk, with the specific kind of attention that knows better than to interfere. Dr. Cho passed her a cup of water without saying anything. She drank it. General Vasquez was looking at her left hand. She let him look. When the Veth spoke again, the configuration was different. Nodes she hadn't seen used before. An arrangement that the translation matrix flagged as reserved for fundamental reclassifications. The assessment has been revised, the swarm said. Humanity is reclassified as a Class II indeterminate species. This classification is without precedent. It designates a cognitive architecture that cannot be modeled with confidence from available data. A pause. It requires continued observation. How long? Vasquez asked. Indefinitely, the swarm said. You are not predictable enough to assess. It was not, Mara reflected, a glowing commendation. But indeterminate was not ended. Indeterminate was not quarantine. Indeterminate was a question the Veth didn't know how to close, and a question they couldn't close was a question they would keep coming back to, and a question they kept coming back to was a relation, and a relationship was time, and time was everything. She stood up. Her left hand made 4 small adjustments as she picked up the transit device. She watched it happen. She was still surprised by it every time. "One more thing," she said. The swarm waited. "The fly," she said, "the one that was in the chamber, the other half of what I've become." She looked at the device in her hand. "Somewhere out there, there's a fly with my original visual cortex and my left-hand motor control. Wandering around my laboratory, it has approximately 1 day of viable life left. It will spend that day navigating a human space with human sensory equipment it has absolutely no framework to interpret."
She paused.
"It's not going to make it. But for however long it does, it's going to be the only organism of its kind in the known universe, seeing things nothing has ever seen the way it's seeing them." She set the device back on the table. "I think about that," she said. "I don't know what to do with it, but I think about it." The swarm was quiet. "That is grief," one of the node configurations offered. The translation matrix flagged the word with a confidence rating of 11%. "Maybe," Mara said. "Or maybe it's something close to it. We have a lot of words for the things that don't have clean solutions. That's part of the architecture too." She found the fly 2 hours later in the corner of the laboratory behind the secondary monitor. It was alive. It was moving slowly, and it was moving in a way that made her breath catch. Not the random, wall-testing motion of a fly navigating by instinct, but something more deliberate. It was positioned in the corner where the light from the 2 windows overlapped and warmed the floor, and it had its front legs raised, feeling something, testing. Fina understood without it that was an itch to it which reaching toward the warmth, the way she would reach toward warmth, and that, inside whatever remained of its neural architecture, was a fragment of what had been her, finding comfort in an old language. She sat down on the floor next to it. She knew the research teams were coming. She knew there would be medical imaging and debriefs and careful scientific documentation of what the transit had done to her, and that the documentation would begin the process of making a controlled version of it, and that the controlled version would eventually produce something humans could use deliberately rather than by accident, and that the Veth would be watching all of it, re-evaluating their Class 2 determination with each new data point, recalibrating their models around a species that kept producing outputs their models hadn't specified. She knew all of that was coming. She let it wait. She sat on the floor of her laboratory and watched the fly navigate a world too large and too complicated and too full of unfamiliar signals for something its size, and it was surviving anyway, finding the warm patches, using what it had. And she thought about her mother's rule: you get your panic, you schedule it. And she thought about the transit chamber and the dry whisper she hadn't investigated. And she thought about mistake and engine and poverty and necessity, and she let her left hand do its small adjustments against the cool floor, reaching for nothing, finding nothing, practicing a motion that wasn't hers and wasn't not hers anymore either. The Veth were in orbit. The indeterminate species was on the floor. She hummed something low and tuneless, the way she always hummed when she was working through a problem she couldn't see the end of. The fly's front legs slowed. It turned toward the sound. Whether that was cognition or vibration response, she couldn't say, and she decided it didn't matter, because either way, something small and temporary was orienting toward something warm, and that was enough to work with. Tomorrow she would write the paper. Tonight she sat with the things she'd become, and the things she hadn't meant to make, and she let the compound eyes show her everything at once. The fly, the warm floor, the monitors, the darkened windows, the first stars coming through the glass, and far above them a fleet of ships belonging to a civilization that had never before encountered a species it couldn't close a file on. The fly lasted until morning. She was there when it stopped. She wrote the cause of death in her notebook the way her mother had taught her to write anything final, plainly, without drama, because the event was already large enough without you making it larger. Then she went to the coffee pot, found it empty, rinsed it out, and started a new batch. 40 minutes later, Ernesto knocked on the lab door. She called him in without turning around, watching him with her compound eyes as he stopped in the doorway and took in the room. The evidence of the transit, her changed left hand, the transit device, the small still shape in the corner behind the secondary monitor. He was quiet for a long time. "Are you okay?" he asked. She considered the question the way she considered all the questions that were too large for a quick answer. "I can see the entire room," she said all at once. "I can see you and the door and the windows and the coffee and the fly and the stars outside, all simultaneously, all right now." She turned toward him then and let him see the eyes that were not entirely hers. "I have no idea if I'm okay, but I have more data than I've ever had, and the Verth reclassified us, and the coffee is almost ready." She paused. "So I'm working with what I've got." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's very you," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She poured the coffee when it was ready and handed him a cup, and they stood in the quiet laboratory while the morning came through the windows and the compound eyes showed her all of it at once. Every angle, every detail, every ordinary, miraculous, specific thing. And she was afraid, and she was altered, and she was still, undeniably, irreducibly herself. That was the thing the Veth couldn't model. That was the thing that had always been the engine.